Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Mark Brannon. I'm the president of the Princeton Adult School, and once again, welcome all of you coming, and especially since tonight's election night, so I know that many of you are anxious, I'm sure, to get back to the televisions and see what the results, or maybe not. Tonight's speaker is Mr. Peter Kahn. And it's really a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce Peter. I've known Peter, I think, for 30 years or so, since he came back to the United States. Peter is truly a Princetonian, probably one of the few here in the audience who can say that, because Peter was born and raised here, and he just told me that he, last week or 2 weeks ago, attended his 50th high school reunion at Princeton High. So more than 50% of his classmates showed up, and he said he couldn't even recognize many of them. Peter Kahn is the former chairman of Dow Jones and Company and the editorial director of Dow Jones Publications. In 1967, Peter became the Wall Street Journal's first resident reporter in Vietnam. From 1969 to 75, he continued to cover that war, the Vietnam War, as well as other events across Asia as a roving reporter from Hong Kong. He was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 1972 for distinguished reporting on international affairs for his coverage of the 1971 India-Pakistan War. A couple of years later, in 1976, Mr. Kahn was named the first publisher and editor of the Asian Wall Street Journal, headquartered in Hong Kong. After 12 years in Asia, he returned to the U.S. in 1979, and the next year was named associate publisher of the Wall Street Journal and the vice president of Dow Jones. Later in that year, he was named the president and chief operating officer of Dow Jones and became the CEO in January of 1991 and served in that role for 15 years. He served as the journal's publisher from 1989 until July 2002. Mr. Kahn is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Institute for Advanced Studies here in Princeton. He's a former member of the Pulitzer Prize Board. He's a trustee emeritus of the Asia Society, and he currently serves in the adjunct faculty of Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. As I said, he is a native of Princeton. He's come back to live here, raising his children here. He went to that school up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and got a bachelor's degree in government. He even began his newspaper career here in Princeton and while he was a high school student as a copy boy for the Princeton Packet. So we are continuing on with our course, The Medium is the Message, Communication for the 21st Century. Mr. Kahn is going to talk about print media in crisis. He's not feeling well, so I really do appreciate his coming in to talk. He's got bronchitis, and he's asked whether he could talk to us from the seated position over there. So please join with me in welcoming Mr. Peter Kahn.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Not really? Well, no, maybe they can you turn the volume up a bit? All right, does this work better? Okay, thank you. And Mark, thank you for the very kind introduction. Mark is indeed a friend of 30 plus years and probably knows me as well as anyone else, both inside and out, since he was my gastroenterologist for many years. Anyway, and I do apologize if I cough some tonight or have to stop once in a while, but I think we'll get through. It is interesting that so many Princetonians are out here on this kind of seminal election night when, of course, y'all could be home glued to the computer screens or TV screens with the minute-by-minute results. So I'm thinking just possibly some of you at least are part of a generation of newspaper readers who actually can wait until the morning to open a newspaper and read the results. In the context of the talk I'm going to give, that would be very encouraging. Although, as Mark implied, maybe many of us here won't want to see the results at all. Anyway, putting tonight's issue in a nutshell, in the kind of lead someone might put on a newspaper article. I was talking a couple of evenings ago at the Institute for Advanced Study to Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google. Eric said he still reads 2 newspapers in print every single day, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And that's good news. I mean, Eric understands that print actually is the best way to access and absorb serious news coverage with both breadth and depth. So that's the good news. The bad news is he said he's the very last person at Google who still reads a newspaper. So, I am certainly going to admit to a lifelong love affair with newspapers as a writer for them and a reader of them. I like that newspapers employ trained and talented reporters to cover and uncover news, and editors who often at least have experience and judgment to kind of sift and sort the news and guide me through the most important developments. I like the organization of newspapers, including a format that separates, however imperfectly, news and opinion. I love the serendipity of newspapers. That is, that they tell me things that I didn't ask for or even think would interest me until I found them in the newspaper that day. I like newspapers because at their best, they can actually do rather extensive, insightful, exploratory journalism that gets beyond today's headlines and behind the news. I like newspapers because they espouse standards and values like truth and honesty and fairness, even if they don't always live up to those values. And I like the fact that newspapers have personalities, much like people. I mean, the personalities of the papers I read have changed over the years. The New York Times has become a rather more progressive and politicized newspaper than I first remember it in the days of Arthur Kroc and James Reston. The Wall Street Journal has become more flashy, more focused on general interest news than it certainly was in Barney Kilgore's era or even my own. The New York Post, which I recall as this kind of lively liberal muckraker newspaper of my youth with Murray Kempton and many other brilliant columnists, has now become more given to gossip and scandal and crime and so on. But personalities may shift, but newspapers are still old friends. And I'm still in the habit of having coffee with them every morning. That is at least true for me. It may be true for some of you. It is sadly not true for my kids, and perhaps not for yours either. I mean, I have 4 kids, and even growing up in a house with 2 career journalists and indeed 2 Pulitzer Prize winners, none of our kids actually regularly read a newspaper. Not in print and not even regularly online. They read books, they watch TV, they go online, but for them, a newspaper is not a habit that they have ever developed. Thus, I doubt they ever will. Now, you extend that across many millions of families, and what you get these days is the obvious. I mean, newspapers around the country are shrinking in size and in numbers. Newspaper circulations, almost without exception, are rapidly declining. Advertising is disappearing from newspapers incrementally year by year. The newspapers are cutting costs and staffs and news coverage, though they can't seem to do it fast enough to match the revenue declines. And all too many newspapers are simply dying, and more will do so in coming years. Now, sentimentality for newspapers aside, does that matter? I mean, there is a pretty good argument, and I buy it in theory, that what matters is news, not newspapers. News, not the peculiar newsprint form of news delivery. By news, what I mean are flows of accurate, honest, truthful information that are relevant to individuals and that are essential to the functioning of a free society. And that's really what Thomas Jefferson had in mind when he made that famous statement that given a choice, he would rather have newspapers without government than government without newspapers. But the world has changed a good deal since his day, or even our youth. And the younger generations clearly have grown up without this habit of reading newspapers, but I think also with rather less recognition of what is news. I mean, they are bombarded with constant and confusing cascades of information, opinions, entertainment, and endless trivia that may or may not pass for news. They've been raised in an education system that I think all too often teaches them there is no such thing as truth, that it is only in the eye of the beholder. They expect instant everything, so from fast foods to instant messaging to absolutely anything in real time 24/7. And they expect a limitless array of such choices. They live in an increasingly fragmented society that no longer, by and large, eats family dinners together or watches TV together or gets its news from the same sources or even shares the same unspoken set of social values. And so it is not surprising that the concept of the old-fashioned newspaper kind of landing on the doorstep, being read by the whole family, being read by the neighbors, knitting together in a way the society, is simply not for them. And yet if we, like Jefferson, believe that news, if not newspapers, matter, then where is that news going to come from as the newspapers fade away? Well, TV, you might say, but I think not. I mean, TV is an enormously impactful visual medium, and it can do certain kinds of crisis news coverage very powerfully. It does sports exceptionally well. But it is essentially an entertainment medium. And most of what passes for TV news, even on the so-called cable news channels, really amounts to pundits yelling opinions at each other, largely a form of entertainment. The internet, yes and no. I mean, it's a phenomenal new medium. Basically anything we want in the world now at our fingertips. Like most of you, I use Google. My kids even have me on Facebook, though 3 out of the 4 refuse to be my friends on Facebook. But as a news medium, the internet hasn't demonstrated much yet. Now, I think this is partly because the internet is much better at delivering to you the kinds of information you know you want to know, rather than what you didn't want to know. It is kind of the opposite of that serendipity I mentioned about newspapers. Mainly, however, it's because very few of the internet news sites make any investment in reporting news. You know, they collect news and they deliver news, but they only very rarely originate it. There are a few exceptions for those of you who may use Politico occasionally. They do some genuine political reporting, at least in Washington. There's a site called Global Post that is beginning to do some fairly serious international coverage. There is a site called ProPublica that does some really fine investigative reporting. But those are really the very rare exceptions. And most of the rest simply rely on the infirm old newspapers and their shrinking staffs to cover or uncover the news, which the internet sites then pick up. And then they top off the derivative news, or more often actually drown it, with opinions and more opinions and more opinions. Partly perhaps because opinions sell, but I think at least as important because opinions are cheap. You know, to field a professional reporter trying to write seriously about some national subject is going to cost $100,000 a year or so. You know, to put on the air, whether it's the TV screen or on the computer screen, a bunch of people yelling opinions at each other is essentially free. And by the way, none of those 3, what I would call best of the internet, Politico, Global Post, or ProPublica, none of them make a profit. So in the long run, for something to succeed in this marketplace, it has to find not just a news model, but a business model, and none of them have yet. All right, then how about the newspapers, which do still understand the importance of news, smartly transforming themselves into reader-friendly online publications? So what of the internet editions of the print newspapers? But before we get to that, I want to take you on a very brief tour of kind of modern publishing history, right? For most of the second half of the 20th century, newspaper, and it applied largely to magazine publishing too, was a very good business. I mean, every city or town had a newspaper, but very few had two newspapers. Metro and community newspapers were virtual monopolies and thus made most of their money from advertising. The traditional family-owned papers, wealthy as they were, increasingly sold out to larger newspaper chains to avoid inheritance taxes. And those newspaper chains became similarly very profitable corporations. Now, some of those corporations actually cared some about good news coverage. Some cared less so. But they all cared about advertising. So this tide of ad dollars from department stores, from auto dealers, from auto companies, from cosmetics companies, from, you name it, camouflaged a lot of publishing sins for a lot of years. Inefficient production systems, rich union contracts, overstaffing in most departments of newspapers, probably excessive executive salaries. And, some of these sins came back to haunt later on when the market turned down. To please the all-important advertisers, the newspapers and magazines chased larger and larger audiences. So who subscribed became much less important than how many. It became increasingly a numbers game. And thus you saw more and more special offers and special discounts and giveaway circulations of various sorts, and buy a publication and get 2 free gifts of some sort, a portable phone and a basketball. And I mean, I think I don't exaggerate much to say, who any longer actually pays full price for any magazine? I doubt anyone in this audience does. If you subscribe to The Economist, you might. Many of us don't pay any price for magazines. They simply come into our home and they send periodic messages saying your subscription is over, by the way, a subscription I never paid for. And, and we're going to take it away from you soon. But it never goes away because the subscription, they can count that subscription in their rate base to sell it to advertisers. Who any longer knows whether they are paying the same newspaper subscription price as their next door neighbor, or actually what the subscription price really is. So it all became very self-destructive. The advertisers over time became less entranced with all this circulation gimmickry, and distributing more and more copies for less and less revenue was hardly smart economics. And in the process, the publishers by and large devalued the one prize asset they really had, which was their news. So how can it be, I used to ask my Wall Street Journal colleagues, that consumers are willing to pay $2 for a bad cup of coffee, but they are skeptical of paying $1 for a good newspaper? The answer was that we, over time, had led them to place little or no value on our product. And our product essentially is the news. So with that as a kind of sad background, then along came the internet, an exciting new opportunity for newspaper publishers, right? And the publishers, seduced by who, by the way, were mostly middle-aged men, so they weren't exactly the young people who understood the internet the best. The publishers became seduced by the allure of this wondrous new distribution medium, and they hired themselves a bunch of young internet groupies, and they bought into the internet mantra that the internet, by definition, was a free medium. Actually, if the middle-aged publishers had ever been on porno sites, and probably some had, they might have questioned that mantra, because the porno sites actually had figured out some subscription models, but perhaps they were all too moral for that. Anyway, so the publishers took all the same news that they were charging for still in their print editions, and then they added interactivity and archival access and instant updates and eventually video and all kinds of bells and whistles, and then gave that away free, right, on their internet editions to the same customers and to new ones who were still expected to pay a fair price for the news in print. It was a totally illogical proposition, right? It assumed that there was going to be some enormous flow of internet advertising that would pay for everything. That didn't happen, and in a world of unlimited supply of internet advertising, it is unlikely ever to happen. It devalued the primary publishing asset again, which is news. It accelerated the decline of the print circulations, and at least marginally of the more profitable print advertising. It left the unprofitable internet editions almost entirely dependent for news flows on the shrinking print newspaper staffs. And it left the publishers in the end juggling these twin products, the old ones, the print ones, in perhaps inexorable decline, and the new ones in a strange form of commercial denial. And praying that somehow the future was going to be different. And I would argue that the future really isn't going to be different unless and until the publishers take the risk of charging online. I mean, that is much harder now than it would have been a decade plus ago, before they had led customers to expect the news for free. It's somewhat harder for general interest newspapers to do it than it was, say, for the Wall Street Journal, which did start off as a paid subscription site and now has 1 million plus subscribers paying full online subscriptions. But the point still is that publishers have to pick their poison. I mean, they can either die slowly, or they can take this risk and perhaps live on successfully and profitably in a new form. The free alternative, I think, simply leaves the online edition with their growing audiences, which after all are largely cannibalized from the print audiences, relying on the poor print editions, again, for almost all the news that they give away. And then there's sadly less and less of that to give away, so the ultimate loser is the public. It's now, that we could go on with some of the business problems of the press, but let me also look briefly, at least, at some of the more substantive ones, the journalistic problems. because not all the fault here in the decline of the print medium is the fault of the publishers or the corporate CEOs. I think some of it is also the fault of editors and even reporters. So briefly, let me give you some examples of what I mean. Okay, I think over the years, there has been far too much blending of news with entertainment in a lot of the traditional media. And, you know, because journalism that puts too high a priority on entertainment is almost destined to distort and to mislead. And entertainment that masquerades as journalism, I think, is even more insidious because it taints and tarnishes the real thing. But you see an awful lot of that blending. You see it all over television, of course, or television news, such as it is. You see it all over the internet, and you see all too much of it in print as well. I mean, then similarly, there's this blurring of lines between news and opinion. And there is obviously room for both, and both can be very well done. But this oughtn't to be a stew. It ought to be kept as separate courses of a meal, like the meat and dessert. As I said, the traditional newspapers at least have a format that kind of preserves that distinction. Although some of them are slipping too. But the other forms of media, I mean, magazines don't really pretend to separate the two. Television makes almost no pretense at separating the two. Okay, another issue is what I would call predatory pack journalism. That is, in which reporters who individually tend most often to be very independent, honest, fair-minded people, tend as a pack to lose their common sense and often their sense of fairness. And so what the public winds up seeing on story after story is a spectacle of a pack of hounds in pursuit of a quarry. And that quarry may be a politician of either party, it may be a celebrity of some sort, it may be someone who made a reasonably harmless mistake on a slow news day. But once this press pack piles on, the victim has very little chance of escape. And it's a kind of blood sport for the media, but it is also one that I think is increasingly offensive to large parts of the public. Okay, then what I'd call all too pervasive negativism and cynicism across much of the media. And this is different from skepticism. I mean, I think skepticism actually is essential to the media's role. And criticism by the media is often warranted by facts. But, you know, cynicism is a kind of mindset that misshapes reality. And I think it offends the public again. And the public, by the way, commonsensically understands that not all news is bad news, even if almost all the news they see and read is bad news. So there's this, again, this juxtaposition. Somewhat too much social orthodoxy or elitism in the mainstream media. I mean, is environmentalism always good, for example, and big business always bad? I think from much of the media, that is the message you would get, but obviously there world is a little more complicated than that. Um, you know, elitism, and I don't want to overstate this because journalists are not all snobs, but journalists, many of them, did go to the same kinds of schools in the same kinds of towns in the same parts of the country, and they tend to congregate in, above all, Washington and New York, and they spend a lot of time talking to other journalists. So they don't necessarily meet an awful lot of Americans who drive pickup trucks or who go to church every Sunday or who go hunting on weekends or who are staunchly pro-life, or you could add many to that list. So when the press goes out and covers that America, it's a bit like the reporter visiting some strange tribe in Africa. And that sense of bemusement, whatever you might call it, comes through often in the coverage, and again is somewhat offensive to the people being written about. So I think it's not surprising, actually, that the mainstream media for so long actually ignored and then dismissed the Tea Party movement as it grew and grew and grew under our journalistic noses. Okay, then getting toward the end of this list, there's what I would call the David-Goliath paradox, right? The press, I mean, particularly since the Vietnam War and Watergate, brought very skeptical and critical coverage to almost every large and powerful and traditionally respected American institution. So the military, the CIA, big business, oil companies, drug companies, the Catholic Church, pickets. Much of that coverage, by the way, over the years has been good. But the result is that almost every traditionally respected or even sacrosanct American institution has to some extent been tarnished, perhaps tarnished by its own actions, but tarnished also by the degree of press coverage that has received. So here's the problem. I mean, the press likes to pretend to be a little David that is courageously out there smiting these Goliaths, the gutsy little editor versus the giant predatory corporation. But the public doesn't necessarily see it that way. What the public, over recent years particularly, has come to see is a press that is a large and powerful institution in its own right. That would be true of many of the larger press parts, and it would certainly be true of the mainstream press as a whole. So the public, trained by the press to be skeptical of anything big and powerful, now subjects the media to precisely that same public skepticism, and the press too winds up being tarnished. And then I guess finally, I mean, there's the media's attention span, by which I really mean lack thereof. You know, as it kind of hops from crisis to crisis to crisis, almost always emphasizing conflict, because that makes for good stories, and all too rarely providing a whole lot of context. The real problem with that is that in a world where everything is considered critical, as the media might have it, is anything actually taken very seriously? And I think that's another point that consciously or subconsciously the public comes to understand. So the overall point there is that the old media, the so-called mainstream media, I think have, in addition to some pretty foolish business mistakes that they've made over the years, have also given readers some pretty good reasons to lose trust and faith and to drift away, as so many of them are. So now try to end on a slightly more hopeful note. What's going to happen from here on out? I mean, some print newspapers, I think, are likely to survive for at least another generation. The biggest and the best of them, I think, are likely to survive as wards, you might even say charity wards, of much larger, richer, often entertainment conglomerates. I mean, the Wall Street Journal is a very good example of that. I mean, I didn't happen to want to see it sold, but it was sold, and it was sold to Rupert Murdoch and his Fox company, and it's being treated pretty generously within that giant enterprise. Murdoch likes newspapers. He's proud to own the Wall Street Journal. He invests money in it. He's expanded it in various ways. And the Wall Street Journal comprises less than 5% of the revenue and less of the profit of Fox. So, one pretty good movie produced in Hollywood by Fox can subsidize the Wall Street Journal for another couple of years. And, that's not, at least in the short or medium term, a bad fate for the Wall Street Journal. Somewhat similarly, the Washington Post, another traditionally fine newspaper, which loses money these days, is subsidized by Kaplan, the education company that the Washington Post Corporation owns and which makes a lot of money. So happily the Graham family can afford to keep the Washington Post, maybe not give it as many reporters as it wants and so on, but I don't think they're under any great pressure to fold it or sell it. The Financial Times is essentially subsidized by the Pearson Company's textbook businesses, which are much bigger businesses than the FT. Business Week, for those of you who ever read it, is now part of Bloomberg, and a very small part of Bloomberg, but they seem proud to own it. And you might ask, what of the New York Times, which struggles along these days, maybe making a little money, maybe losing a little money, but certainly still a great newspaper. And my guess is that somewhere in the next 5 years, the New York Times is going to have to find a home somewhat like the Wall Street Journal did, or like the Washington Post or the FT have, inside a bigger corporation that would be proud of owning the New York Times, would invest some money in it, so long as it doesn't lose too much money, and could support it with a dozen other much more profitable, media entertainment kind of businesses, and that would not be a bad fate for the Times. All right, at the other end of the spectrum from these big ones, which I think will survive one way or the other, you have the local community newspapers. I mean, the Town Topics or Princeton Packet or, their counterparts around the country. I think most of those kind of genuine community newspapers are going to survive too. I mean, they offer genuinely unique, useful coverage to a genuine community of interest, largely geographic interest. In between, there are going to be some papers that figure out they can profit from charging a full and fair price to subscribers, that a smaller but more loyal audience is going to be a more profitable one, and some of those may survive. I think that's the intent of the new owners of the Philadelphia Inquirer. We'll see whether they can pull it off. But, many are not going to fit those categories, and many newspapers are simply not going to survive. Niche publications, whether magazine or newsprint, on business, science, medicine, even narrow politics or foreign policy, probably can find a way to keep publishing. Again, so long as what they're serving are fairly small, well-defined, high demographic audiences. I mean, think The Economist there, which is a genuine, high quality, and still reasonably successful magazine. The broader interest general magazines are not going to make it. Newsweek is essentially dying, and I would guess time will follow it in the next 3 or 4 years. Some print publications, back to my earlier point, are going to take the risk to charge online. And for some of those, that risk is going to pay off. And what they're going to wind up with is 2 healthy paid circulations, one print, one online, hopefully charging about the same for each and giving people their choice as to which they'd prefer, or linking the two and saying for, a third off you can get both. And those may have a pretty good future. The internet is going to spawn some genuine news sites. I mean, the Politico, Global Post sort, but also at the local level. I mean, there are some modest examples now in places like San Diego and Minneapolis of fairly serious local online news sites. None of them, I think, make money yet. Many of them have a little bit of foundation financing of some sort, but a few of them may prove it can be done. Foundations or family trusts may wind up subsidizing some old or new media and provide some new sources of funding. That ProPublica I mentioned is supported by a family called the Sandlers, who actually committed, I think, $30 million a year to it for 5 years or something, a lot of money. And then there's even talk of various forms of government funding for media. In my view, for any media to welcome, that would be a kind of sign of desperation. I mean, governments don't pass out money without some political strings attached. A press that is so proud, as we should be, of our First Amendment independence, I think looks hypocritical if it then turns around to seek funding from government. And, government-funded media should not really be out there and competing with other media that don't have that funding in the marketplace. I think if we needed an indication of the pitfalls of that, you can think back a few weeks ago to the NPR firing of Juan Williams, right? Where, to overstate it slightly, you wind up having government-funded commissars of a liberal network kind of cavalierly firing a distinguished journalist for transgressing some code of political correctness. I think that is not a model one wants to see repeated in the American media. So, to conclude now, the best hope I can see here is for a continuing period of media turmoil, of declines and deaths and new experiments, and in some cases exciting births. And eventually that's going to lead to a media world of many mixed models. Some print, some online, some paid, some free, some profitable, some money-losing, and some nonprofit, some niche, some mass, some quality journalism, which is what I've always most cared about, and probably a good deal of junk journalism. That new media world is going to be a long way from the rather staid one I grew up in. But it is going to be inhabited by the kind of kids that, as Mark referenced earlier, I teach these days once a week or so at Columbia Journalism School. And these are remarkably bright and entrepreneurial and idealistic young people who, for all the problems they see around them in the world of journalism, still believe journalism can be a great career. So, ending on a note of genuine optimism, I think there is a pretty good chance that some of those youths and others like them are going to be the ones who figure out the new news models and business models that can preserve news, even serious news, as I think we have known it, and maybe even help to preserve newspapers. So that's enough from me, and happy to answer some questions. Sorry.
If you're willing, we can take some questions.
Sure, yes. Yes, sir.
I feel that newspapers or any other media being supported by the government fund is going to put pressures on them that somebody like Fox or some other corporation would not.
Well, I think there are pressures of all sorts on all forms of journalism. I just see a distinction between a publisher who owns, or at least his company owns a newspaper, deciding he or she wants to change editors for whatever reason and getting on with it and doing it. That's always been part of the business. To me, that's a little different from my taxes funding a news organization that then chooses to impose some set of political beliefs on its staff. There are liberal news organizations in this country and conservative ones and all kinds in between. But the distinction is, you know, INU as taxpayers are not being asked to support their decisions, right? The marketplace is supporting their decisions. Yes, ma'am?
I want to thank you for coming. You obviously don't feel great about tax that. But I think there's so many great examples in the 19th and 20th and into the 21st century of muckraking and investigative journalism that expose things that we would not have known about that we wanted to know. And it was because the newspapers believed in the reporters and paid them to digging and everything. What is going to happen to that when we're not, as you suggested early on, paying for really quality reporters to ask the hard questions and to persist? And who's going to protect us as citizens?
Yeah, well, that is really you frame the core issue very well. You know, that as newspapers have shrunk their staffs because they have less money, predictably the first thing they cut, if the newspapers of any size, cut their foreign reporting bureaus because that's particularly expensive reporting. You know, to keep a reporter in Baghdad is going to cost you $300,000 a year. So the international staffs have shrunk enormously. By now, there are probably no more than 3 American newspapers that have international news staffs, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and in a small way, the Washington Post. Whereas when I was a reporter in Asia, there were probably 15 American newspapers that had their own reporters covering the Vietnam War or the opening of China or whatever the issues were in Asia. I mean, papers like the Minneapolis Star and the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Atlanta Constitution, and, you know, they all did that. That's gone. Second thing that gives is investigative reporting, because that is not very cost efficient. I mean, you may have to support a team of 4 or 5 reporters who poke around into all kinds of issues, often not coming up with very much for a couple of months before maybe they come up then with a great expose of some sort, which then may take 2 months to fully report and edit and publish. So you've invested 4 or 5 people's salaries over 6 months for one great story. I mean, the best of the papers will still do it, but very few. So the third thing that's given, which is actually equally serious, is State House coverage. So it used to be that pretty much every newspaper in New Jersey, even the fairly small ones, had a reporter assigned to Trenton to cover the workings of the state government. And I mean, if there's any state government that needed reporters poking around, asking questions, and this one was pretty high on the list. But I think now it is down to three reporters covering the state government in Washington. I mean, in Trenton. And that's almost negligible coverage. And that's you can find that state by state by state. So that's the problem. The what can replace it, internationally, there's going to have to be more and more reliance on wire services, on Associated Press and Reuters, and to some extent Bloomberg, which is a big, rich media institution because it's not trying to make its money off journalism. It makes its money selling screens to traders for, $1,000 a month, but that subsidizes a lot of journalists. So I think internationally, with the exception probably of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, it's almost all going to be abdicated to some wire services, which are not, that's not ideal because they don't do the most in-depth kind of coverage. The State House coverage stuff, some of it may be picked up by these little online groups of journalists who think they can do it. The problem is none of them have figured out a business model at which they can make money at it. And the investigative, that's what this ProPublica group does. And they do, as long as the foundation money lasts. They have roughly 30 reporters who actually do nothing but investigative reporting. And that's not insignificant, but I think that wouldn't make up for all the investigative reporting that has disappeared from literally hundreds of newspapers around the country. Yes?
You talked about the corporations taking over newspapers and sort of running them. Do you have a concern about the distortion of the news based upon the corporations' personal interest, having a pony in the race or whatever? You've also what Fox News has done to Channel 5, made news in New York, to the Wall Street Journal, turning it into a basically advertising market, we call it party, at least Fox News. Yeah, it is. But that happens to the New York Times, and that happens to other newspapers. How much independent, deep reporting are they going to be allowed to do when it runs contrary to the interests of the corporation that owns it?
Well, try to explain this, at least from my own experience. I ran a modest newspaper empire with, the Wall Street Journal and Barron's and international editions, and we owned a couple of dozen community newspapers around the country and so on, right? So, my politics happen to be fairly conservative, not partisanly so, I think, but ideologically so. And yet, I think the Wall Street Journal news coverage for most of the period I was ultimately responsible for it was mostly attacked for being too liberal. That our Washington bureau, headed by a very good journalist named Al Hunt, who was an avowed liberal, was much more sympathetic in a lot of people's views to the Democrats in Washington than to the Republicans. We did a lot of very critical news coverage of big corporations. We got on lots of crusades for righting wrongs in the society and helping minorities. And, now, why was that? Not because I ordered that or stopped it. It was because the real power on newspapers rests much more with the reporters than with anyone else. This idea that the proprietor or the CEO is going to march down into the newsroom and say, I want to get rid of all that liberal bias in the paper tomorrow. It just doesn't work that way. The reporters are almost, to a person, liberal. I don't say that that's good or bad. That is simply who they are. the career attracts idealists. You know, it attracts very bright young people who, if they cared about money, would go to law school or business school. But because they care about improving society, they go to work as journalists. And they carry that kind of rather sweet liberal bias with them through their work days, day after day after day. Above them sit a level of mid-level editors. The mid-level editors are a half generation older, so perhaps a bit wiser. And they do kind of try to knock some of the most overt bias out of coverage. But, you know, most of them are pretty liberal too. So by the time you get up to the level of an editor who I, as publisher or CEO, would have appointed, the story, whatever it is, has already been through the reporter and 2 or 3 junior editors. And, you know, the reporter, the senior editor, who may in fact be my appointee, says, hey, what do you want me to do? You know, that's the stuff I'm getting in. So, and it's not inaccurate. I've never quite accepted, I think. Mess that up.
Battery died.
There. Can you hear now or not? Yeah, so, you know, I just think it's not quite as simple as you would suggest. You know, and I mean, even Fox, which you might say in the TV world, all right, you have Fox over here with a conservative bias, and you have MSNBC over here with a similarly liberal bias. You know, both of them do some decent reporting in the daytime, although at night all they do is opinion. You are right. The decision to do either conservative bias or liberal bias journalism in the evening is clearly dictated by money. I mean, this isn't dictated by some ideological passions of Jeffrey Immelt at GE or even Rupert Murdoch at News Corporation. They both found they can make more money appealing to the biases of an audience they pursue, conservatives over here, liberals over here, and the network CNN that has made a somewhat game effort to stay more in the center and be less biased than the other two is a low number 3 in the ratings. So, you know, that doesn't say much for our tastes in a way. One more? Sure.
With the job market shrinking, how do you see the career track for journalists? How do newspapers or the news media develop young reporters in enough numbers to keep up the quality of news reporting?
Well, I think the career it's a very spotty career track at this point. The newspapers, the remaining newspapers, do hire some young journalists, but that is really to replace some of the older journalists that they're pushing out because the older journalists are more expensive. So, yes, there is a little bit of hope for some of the younger ones, but there isn't similar hope for the middle-aged ones. And I think most of the kids actually are going to have to find jobs somewhere in online journalism. In many cases, probably starting their own little enterprises and experimenting, and in some cases failing, but hopefully in some cases succeeding. But they're not going to, when I entered this career, you kind of came out of college, and if you were really interested in journalism, you applied to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and one or two others, and, there was a pretty good chance one of them was going to give you a chance, and which happened in my case. And, I never stopped to think over 30 or 40 years that I might lose my job. It was all rather Japanese. You kind of had chosen to go to work for this newspaper. As long as you did a reasonably good job, the newspaper would keep giving you interesting assignments, and the newspaper was growing, and the newspaper was making enough money that it could pay me a decent salary. And that was kind of my view of a journalism career. That's very different from today. I mean, I don't think any kid coming out of journalism school now would assume there is the possibility of starting off at a New York Times or a Wall Street Journal and having a straight line career there. So much more risk involved. But happily, some of them are still doing it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.